June 4, 1942. The dawn over the Pacific was the color of steel and smoke. Waves rolled silently beneath the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The morning light glinted off their decks like 1,000 drawn blades. Below deck, young aviators checked their gear with trembling hands, unaware that within hours their empire's invincible fleet would burn. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo studied the gray horizon, his face expressionless. He had already won at Pearl Harbor, at the Indian Ocean, at the Coral Sea. The Americans were broken, or so Tokyo believed. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese reconnaissance planes lifted into the pale sky, engines roaring like caged beasts. They were searching for an enemy that, by every calculation, should not yet be there. Beneath the waves, the ocean held its breath. Far to the east, American Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, built around Enterprise Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were already moving into position. Admiral Chester Nimitz had gambled everything on a piece of intelligence that shouldn't have existed. A decrypted Japanese code. Operation AF, the Japanese, name for Midway, had been cracked wide open by the cryptologists at Station Hypo. What the Japanese believed to be a trap was itself a trap within a trap, yet none of that was visible on the flight decks of Nagumo's carriers. There the air reeked of aviation fuel and tension. Mechanics wiped sweat from their faces, the tropical heat mixing with fear. Pilots smoked in silence. They believed they were about to crush the last American base in the Central Pacific. In Tokyo, newspapers had already prepared victory headlines. Midway falls, America's final line broken. At 6:20 a.m., Nagumo's first wave struck Midway Island. The American base erupted in flames. It looked like the beginning of Japan's final triumph. But even as bombs fell, American scout planes had found them. 4 Japanese carriers 240 miles northwest of the island. The message reached Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. Enemy sighted. There was no hesitation. The order went out. Launch all planes. What followed would not be a battle of strategy or even luck. It would be a convergence of fate, a collision between two nations at the height of their will. Within 5 hours, Japan's illusion of invincibility would vanish beneath the smoke of its own burning ships. The morning sky over the Pacific turned into a crucible of fire and silence. At 7:10 a.m., Nagumo's first wave was returning from Midway, their aircraft battered and low on fuel. Below deck, armorers worked feverishly to rearm the reserve planes for a second strike, this time against any remaining American defenses on the island. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered across hangar decks like scattered dice of fate. Fumes thickened the air, mingling with sweat and the metallic sting of gasoline. Nagumo stood motionless, awaiting reconnaissance reports that would decide the next move. Then came the radio transmission that split his concentration in half. Enemy fleet sighted, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles. For a moment, the bridge fell into absolute stillness. The Americans here? It was impossible. The fleet intelligence reports had been clear. No American carriers could have reached Midway in time. But now the voice of the scout plane confirmed the unthinkable. Out there, beyond the horizon, American carrier decks were already boiling with aircraft engines. Nagumo faced a choice that would decide the fate of the Pacific. His planes returning from Midway were nearly out of fuel. His second wave, still below deck, was being rearmed for another ground strike. To strike the enemy fleet immediately would mean sending up unarmed aircraft. To wait would mean death from above. Minutes dragged into eternity. Nagumo ordered the torpedoes to be swapped back in. The hangar decks turned into a frenzy. Bombs hoisted, torpedoes rolled, hoses coiled. Men shouted through the roar of engines and the shriek of metal. That's when the first shadows appeared in the sky. American torpedo squadrons coming in low, almost suicidal. They flew straight into the heart of the Japanese fleet, unescorted, slow, and doomed. One by one, they were cut to pieces by Zero fighters. Entire squadrons disappeared in the air, leaving nothing but black smoke trails that vanished into the sea. Nagumo exhaled in relief. His formation was intact. The gods of war had favored Japan again. What he could not see was the other wave, far above the clouds, still searching. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown circling desperately for the fleet. Their fuel was running low. Some had already turned back. Then at 10:20 a.m., A break in the clouds revealed the impossible sight. 4 Japanese carriers, decks crammed with fueled aircraft, bombs stacked and unsecured. The message crackled through the radio. Enemy fleet below, are all ships visible? And from 20,000 feet, American dive bombers rolled over, engines screaming, beginning a descent that would change history forever. At 10:22 a.m., the sky ripped open. 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown dropped from the clouds like silent hawks. The first to sight the enemy was Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. He had been searching for hours, nearly out of fuel, guided only by instinct and a faint oil slick that trailed across the sea, a clue left by a retreating Japanese destroyer. That thin line of smoke led him directly over Kaga and Akagi, their decks crowded with bomb-laden aircraft, every plane fueled and armed for a strike that would never come. McCluskey's voice broke over the radio. "Attack! Dive bombers, follow me!" And the Pacific exploded. From 20,000 feet, the dauntless bombers fell almost vertically, the shriek of their dives slicing through the roar of the engines and anti-aircraft fire. Gunners below opened up with everything they had, 25mm cannons, machine guns, tracer rounds arcing into the blue. But the Americans were already committed. Lieutenant Richard Best's bomber lined up on Akagi, the flagship of the entire operation. He released a single 1,000-pound bomb. It struck near the amidships elevator and detonated in the hangar, where dozens of fully armed aircraft waited for takeoff. The explosion was biblical. Flames erupted through the hangar decks, igniting gasoline lines, detonating torpedoes, and setting off secondary blasts that turned Akagi into a furnace. Crewmen screamed as molten steel rained down. On the Kaga, 3 bombs struck almost simultaneously, tearing through the flight deck and igniting the entire arsenal below. The ship's temperature rose so fast that paint blistered off the bulkheads. Sailors leapt overboard, their uniforms ablaze. Within 6 minutes, 2 of Japan's proudest carriers were burning from bow to stern. Further south, Soryu took 3 direct hits from Yorktown's dive bombers. 1 bomb struck her forward hangar, another near the bridge, a third in the aft section. Explosions rolled through her decks in rapid succession, a chain of detonations so violent that her flight deck split open like a can. From a distance, the Japanese formation looked as though the sun itself had fallen upon it. Smoke climbed 10,000 feet into the sky, visible for miles. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of Akagi, staring into the inferno that had once been his fleet. The crew begged him to abandon ship. He refused. Only when the flames reached the bridge did his officers force him into a lifeboat. By 10:30 a.m., the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same force that had humiliated the Allies across the Pacific, was disintegrating before his eyes. 3 carriers destroyed in less than 6 minutes. No plan, no doctrine, no empire could have prepared Japan for that kind of annihilation. The sea that had carried their power now carried their ashes. By 10:40 a.m., the Pacific was a graveyard of steel and fire. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crippled beyond salvation, burning like floating pyres on a blood-colored sea. Only 1 carrier still lived, Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi. Smoke on the horizon marked the death of his comrades, but Yamaguchi did not flinch. He turned to his air staff and gave a simple order: prepare all planes for immediate attack. There was no hesitation, no debate. The Japanese Empire would strike back with its last breath. At 10:45, the first Hiryu strike group launched into the sky, dive bombers led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target, the Yorktown. Below, American radar screens lit up with the approaching formation. The fighters of VF-3 scrambled to intercept, climbing into the sun, but the Japanese came through in perfect formation. At 12:02 p.m., the first bomb struck Yorktown amidships. The blast ripped through her port side, killing dozens and sending walls of flame across the flight deck. 2 more bombs followed in quick succession. Men were blown into the sea. The carrier, listing hard to port, came to a halt, smoke billowing hundreds of feet into the air. Damage control parties fought the inferno with everything they had. Fire hoses hissed, bulkheads glowed red, and ammunition crews flooded magazines to prevent detonation. Within an hour, Yorktown's crew performed the impossible. They saved her. By 1:40 p.m., the fires were out, and the ship began to make way again. But Yamaguchi's second wave was already in the air. Torpedo bombers from Hiryu, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, came in low over the waves, fearless, knowing few would return. American wildcats dove upon them, guns blazing, but the Japanese pressed on. At 2:45 p.m., 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's hull, twisting the steel like paper. The lights flickered, engines died, and the proud carrier began to list heavily. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors leapt into oil-slicked water as explosions echoed through the hull. The Yorktown veteran of Coral Sea and Midway lay crippled and dying. For a brief moment, Yamaguchi believed he had evened the scales. But fate was not finished. American reconnaissance planes from Enterprise had already spotted Hiryu's smoke trail. At 3:30 p.m., another wave of dauntless bombers clawed into the sky, heading straight for the last Japanese carrier. Yamaguchi's men were still refueling and rearming for a third strike when the Americans arrived. At 5:03 p.m., 4 bombs fell from the clouds. Each found its mark. The first hit forward of the island, the second near the aft elevator, the third amidships, the fourth near the hangar deck. The explosions tore through Hiryu's heart. Flames engulfed her bow, swallowing men and machines alike. Yamaguchi refused evacuation. As night fell, he stood on the burning deck beside his flag captain, both saluting the rising flames. "Let us sink with our ship," he said quietly. The sea closed over Hiryu just after midnight. With her went the last of Japan's carriers at Midway, and the illusion that the empire of the rising sun could never be defeated. When the last flames of Hiryu vanished beneath the Pacific, the sea finally fell silent. Smoke hung low over the water like a funeral shroud, carrying the smell of burning oil, scorched flesh, and twisted steel. The waves that had once glittered under the rising sun were now black and slick with fuel, the grave of 4 mighty Japanese carriers that had ruled the Pacific only a day before. The wind carried faint echoes, crackling fires, drifting cries, and the hiss of water swallowing wreckage. For those who survived, it was not victory or defeat that filled the night. It was disbelief. On the deck of the Enterprise, men stood in silence. The adrenaline that had kept them alive through hours of chaos was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. The pilots who had dived through walls of fire now sat beside the island tower, staring at their hands that still trembled from gripping bomb triggers. A few spoke in quiet tones, their words lost to the wind. Others simply watched the horizon, where the last of the Japanese fleet was disappearing into the darkness. They knew what they had done. They knew history had changed. Across the sea, Japanese destroyers searched desperately for survivors. Oil fires still burned on the surface, illuminating the faces of sailors clinging to debris. Many refused rescue, choosing instead to sink with their ships. Others wept openly, calling out for comrades who would never answer. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi's final transmission crackled through the Imperial network. "May our deaths be a light to guide Japan in her future." Tokyo never heard from him again. By midnight, the Pacific was calm again, and unnaturally calm. The ocean that had carried empires now cradled their ruins. Out there, under a sky heavy with smoke and stars, 3,000 Japanese sailors drifted into eternity. No fanfare, no farewell. Just the rhythmic sound of the waves breaking against the twisted remains of an empire's pride. At dawn, American sailors gathered on deck for a quiet service. No one cheered. No one shouted. Chaplains read prayers for both the living and the dead, for enemies and friends alike, because every man who fought that day had seen what war truly was. The sun rose slowly over the endless horizon, casting golden light over the Black Sea. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. Midway had ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. 4 Japanese carriers gone, 1 American carrier lost, thousands dead. And yet, within that silence lay the moment the tide of the Pacific War turned forever. The Japanese Navy would never recover. The illusion of invincibility, born at Pearl Harbor, had burned away at Midway, leaving only ashes, ghosts, and the first faint hope that victory might be possible. For decades, the story of Midway was told as a miracle of courage, a battle won by daring pilots and luck. But beneath that surface burned a truth so secret, it was hidden even from many who fought there. The real victory began months before the first bomb fell, in a dark, cramped basement at Pearl Harbor, filled not with soldiers but with codebreakers. They were not warriors. They were linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators, men who fought their war in silence. Among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a quiet genius who led Station Hypo, America's top naval intelligence unit. His team worked around the clock intercepting Japanese transmissions and trying to break JN-25, the enemy's most complex naval code. Every day they sifted through meaningless strings of numbers and kana, searching for patterns. Sleep was a luxury. Victory depended on what they could find before it was too late. By late May 1942, Rochefort began to suspect that Japan was planning a massive operation against a target codenamed AF. Washington believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands. But Rochefort had a hunch it meant Midway. To prove it, he devised a deception. At his request, the U.S. base on Midway sent an uncoded radio message claiming its water distillation system had broken down. Days later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short on water. The trap had worked. The enemy's plan was exposed. When Rochefort sent his findings to Admiral Nimitz, the entire course of history shifted. The U.S. now knew when, where, and how Japan would strike. Nimitz gambled everything on that intelligence. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, exactly where the Japanese fleet least expected them. Midway was no accident. It was a trap, and the Imperial Navy sailed straight into it. But the men of Station Hypo never celebrated. They remained in the shadows, their work classified for decades. Rochefort himself was denied official credit, his contribution buried under layers of bureaucracy and pride. He died before the world ever knew how much he had done. Only years later did historians uncover the truth, that Midway was not just one in the skies, but in the silence of that secret room filled with radio static and endless nights. The codebreakers had turned the tide of war not with guns, but with intellect. Their victory was invisible, their reward forgotten. Yet without them, the Pacific might have burned for years longer. In the end, Midway's greatest secret wasn't just how Japan lost. It was how a handful of quiet men, hidden behind walls of static and secrecy, saved the world from darkness. When word of Midway reached Tokyo, it did not come as an official report. It came as a whisper. The Imperial Navy had vanished from radio contact. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had failed to respond for hours. In the war rooms of the Naval General Staff, officers gathered around maps waiting for signals that would never come. When the truth finally arrived, it was too catastrophic to believe. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, received the message aboard his flagship Yamato. All 4 carriers lost. Situation critical. Remaining forces withdrawing. Witnesses later recalled that Yamamoto stood motionless for nearly a minute. His pipe slipped from his hand. The man who had once warned Japan's leaders that war with America would awaken a sleeping giant, now knew. The giant was awake. The victory at Pearl Harbor had lasted only 6 months. The Empire's future, built on speed, surprise, and illusion, had crumbled in a single afternoon. But Japan could not afford to show weakness. When the Imperial headquarters drafted the official communiqué, the truth was buried. Newspapers reported a minor setback, claiming Japan had sunk 2 American carriers and suffered only light losses. The citizens cheered what they believed was another triumph. Behind closed doors, however, the Admiralty descended into silence. Officers destroyed maps, burned classified papers, and swore secrecy under penalty of death. In the corridors of the Navy Ministry, whispers spread that some commanders, even Nagumo himself, might be forced to commit seppuku to erase the shame. Yamamoto refused. No death can undo what was lost, he said. Instead, he turned his grief into resolve. Plans were immediately drawn for a new line of defense across the Pacific, the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls. Yet deep down, Yamamoto knew the truth. Japan had lost not just ships, but time. Time it could never regain. The factories of Tokyo still burned through the night, building aircraft and ships at desperate speed. But for every carrier Japan could build, America would build 6. For every pilot Japan lost, the U.S. would train 100. Midway was more than a defeat. It was the unraveling of an illusion. Inside the Emperor's palace, aides softened the report before presenting it. Emperor Hirohito read it in silence. No one dared speak. Then he whispered a single line that no one recorded officially, but every witness remembered. So the tide has turned. That night, Tokyo glowed under lantern light as usual. Children slept, unaware their empire had begun to die. The sea around Midway was quiet, but in that silence the sound of the empire's first fracture echoed across the Pacific. In the months that followed, the Pacific kept her secrets. The waves rolled over the graves of thousands, Japanese and American alike, erasing the sounds of fire, screams, and steel. But for a handful of men who lived through it, those memories never faded. Their words, recorded decades later, reveal the human side of Midway, the faces behind the flames. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, one of the few Japanese sailors pulled from the sea, wrote years later from his home in obscurity, "We believed we were invincible. That day I saw what arrogance costs. The ocean did not care who we were, only that we had challenged it." He had floated for hours, surrounded by oil and wreckage, listening to the faint cries of shipmates calling for help that never came. The water was thick with fuel, the air unbreathable, the sun merciless. "We were not warriors then," he wrote. "We were children who had angered the gods." American survivors told stories just as haunting. Lieutenant Richard Best, the man whose bomb destroyed Akagi, never forgot the moment he looked down at the carrier through the smoke. "I could see men running on the deck," he said quietly. "You tell yourself it's war, that it's necessary, but you never forget their faces. They were human beings. We were all trapped in something far larger than ourselves." On Midway Island, Marines still spoke of the burning skies and the rain of metal. One corporal years later described it as hell painted across daylight. The air was so thick with smoke that men fought blind, their ears ringing for hours. When it was over, they collected fragments, charred plane parts, helmets, pieces of insignia, and buried them in a shallow pit behind the base chapel. "We didn't know whose they were," he said. "Maybe Japanese, maybe ours. We buried them all together." For the Japanese sailors rescued by American ships, shame was unbearable. Many refused food. Others wept openly when they realized how completely their fleet was gone. One interpreter remembered a captured pilot who whispered, "Tell Admiral Yamamoto, I could not die for him." The translator could not bring himself to reply. These stories remained hidden for decades, buried beneath military pride and political myth. Only later did historians begin to uncover them, piecing together the human cost of a battle long celebrated for strategy and heroism. Beneath every statistic, every ton of steel lost, every aircraft shot down, there were hearts that beat, dreams that ended, and families that never knew where their sons had fallen. Midway was not just a turning point in war. It was a reckoning, a reminder that beneath uniforms and flags, all men share the same ocean, the same fears, the same silence that follows when the guns go quiet. After Midway, as Japan's empire began to contract, its engineers and naval architects turned to desperation disguised as innovation. The Imperial Navy, humiliated and stripped of its carrier strength, poured its dwindling resources into secret weapons meant to restore lost glory, machines so advanced and strange that some remained hidden from history for decades. Deep within the mountains of Honshu, in underground facilities sealed from the outside world, teams of scientists worked under flickering lamps. They called their program Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, a poetic name masking grim intent. The goal, to design weapons capable of turning the tide back in Japan's favor, no matter the cost. Among their creations was the Sentoku I-400 class submarine, the largest ever built at that time. Each was nearly 400 feet long, able to carry 3 Aichi M6A Siren floatplane bombers inside a watertight hangar. These behemoths could surface anywhere in the world, launch aircraft from their decks, and disappear beneath the waves again. One proposed mission targeted the Panama Canal, to cripple America's Atlantic supply route and split its fleets in two. The war ended before the plan could be executed. When American forces discovered the I-400s after Japan's surrender, they were stunned. "It was like finding a ghost ship from the future," one naval officer said. Other projects bordered on madness. Engineers designed suicide torpedoes called Kaiten, one-man submarines packed with explosives, guided by pilots who never intended to return. The idea was born not from cruelty but from despair. Japan was running out of pilots, ships, and hope. Young men volunteered by the hundreds, writing farewell letters to families they would never see again. Only a handful of chitin ever reached combat, but they symbolized the Empire's descent into fatalism, a nation willing to sacrifice everything for a dream already lost. Then there were the Oka rocket planes, tiny, bomb-laden craft that could reach 600 miles per hour when released from a bomber. They were fast, terrifying, and nearly impossible to aim. Most were destroyed before reaching their targets. Still, their very existence showed how far Japan had fallen, from the disciplined precision of Pearl Harbor to the hopeless fury of suicide machines. When the war ended, Allied forces found blueprints for even more unimaginable weapons: jet fighters, rocket interceptors, and submarine aircraft carriers far beyond anything deployed in combat. Most were destroyed, their engineers silenced, their records burned. The Japanese government wanted no trace of them left, no reminder of how desperation had consumed reason. These hidden war machines never changed the outcome of the war, but they revealed something deeper, that after Midway, Japan no longer fought to win, it fought to die with dignity. The empire that once dreamed of ruling the Pacific now dreamed only of not fading quietly into history. While Japan turned inward, building weapons of desperation, America turned outward, into an industrial storm the world had never seen. Midway did more than halt Japan's advance. It awakened the full power of American industry, science, and will. Factories that once made cars, radios, and farm tools now forged the machinery of victory: carriers, bombers, tanks, engines, rolling off assembly lines with mathematical precision. In the summer of 1942, as the smoke still drifted above Midway, the United States launched what newspapers called the arsenal of democracy. The numbers were staggering. Within 1 year, America built more ships than Japan had in its entire navy. Steel mills in Pittsburgh glowed through the night, pouring molten metal into endless molds. Women, once homemakers and clerks, became riveters, machinists, and welders. In California, the air was thick with the hum of B-24 bombers being assembled in hangars so vast that their roofs seemed to touch the clouds. At the Newport News shipyard, new Essex-class carriers rose from the dry docks like floating cities, each faster, larger, and deadlier than the ones lost. The Essex, Bunker Hill, Lexington, and Yorktown too were born not from desperation, but from design, symbols of a nation that had learned, adapted, and refused to stop. By 1944, these ships would fill the Pacific, each one carrying more aircraft than all 4 of Japan's lost carriers at Midway combined. It wasn't just machines that changed. Training programs across the U.S. turned thousands of young farm boys into aviators, engineers, and navigators. The average American pilot in 1944 had more flight hours and combat preparation than any Japanese ace left alive. The balance of experience, once Japan's strength, now belonged to America. In Washington, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a collaboration between the government and universities, pioneered technologies that would redefine modern warfare: radar-guided guns, proximity fuses, improved sonar, and engines that pushed planes higher and faster. Every breakthrough meant fewer American deaths and fewer Japanese victories. To the men who fought, these changes felt like miracles. "We went from surviving to dominating," one U.S. pilot later said. Midway was the wake-up call. After that, we built an empire of factories. By the end of 1943, America's industrial output had become a weapon in itself, one that Japan could never match. The Pacific, once ruled by Japan's carriers, was now a highway of American steel and determination. Midway had not just changed the war. It had changed how wars would be fought forever, not by the strength of armies alone, but by the nations that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast their enemies. Midway was hailed as a triumph, the turning of the Pacific tide, the moment America rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor. But for the men who lived it, victory carried a weight that medals and parades could never erase. Behind every cheer was a memory that refused to fade: the screams in burning cockpits, the faces glimpsed for a heartbeat before they vanished into the sea. For the American pilots who survived, the silence after battle was often worse than the fight itself. Many returned to the decks of their carriers shaking, their flight suits reeking of oil and sweat. Lieutenant Dick Best, whose bomb had doomed Akagi, coughed blood from inhaling fumes during his dive. He never flew again. They told us we'd done something great, he later said. But all I could see were the men we'd killed. He spent years haunted by the image of the Japanese flight deck, men running, flames chasing them, an image that burned deeper than any metal could heal. On the Japanese side, survivors faced a torment even darker. They had not only lost comrades, and they had lost faith. Japan's navy had been their pride, the embodiment of the emperor's divine strength. After Midway, that belief cracked. Captured sailors spoke of unbearable shame. Some refused to eat. Others begged their guards to let them die. One survivor later recalled, "When we saw the sea burning, we knew the gods had turned away from us." In Tokyo, the truth was hidden from the public, but whispers spread. Families received letters stamped "missing in action." Mothers wept in silence, forbidden to ask questions. Officers who had escaped the flames often felt unworthy of survival. Many requested transfers to frontline suicide units, an attempt to erase their guilt through death. Even in America, the cost lingered. Pilots woke screaming from nightmares of burning ships. Some drowned their pain in alcohol. Others retreated into silence. The public celebrated victory, but the veterans knew there is no glory in watching men die, even if they are the enemy. War correspondents visiting Midway months later found the island eerily quiet. The wreckage had been cleared, but the smell of oil and salt still hung in the air. In a small corner near the airfield, someone had placed a wooden cross over a pile of wrecked metal. No name, no flag, just a simple inscription burned into the wood. They fought, they fell. The ocean keeps them. That was Midway's truest legacy. Not triumph or vengeance, but the shared sorrow of men who had seen too much. Beneath the statistics and strategy, both sides had paid the same price: their innocence. By the time the fires on the Pacific died out, the world itself had shifted. Midway was more than a naval engagement. It was the fracture point where the Japanese Empire's rise met its fall. 4 carriers gone in a single day, hundreds of Japan's best pilots, men trained from childhood to die for the emperor, swallowed by the sea. From that moment forward, the Japanese Navy would never regain the initiative. In Tokyo, silence fell across the Imperial General Staff. The emperor's advisors avoided his gaze as reports were read aloud. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all lost. For a nation that had marched across Asia without pause, this was inconceivable. Japan's entire strategy, its dream of a Pacific empire, had depended on naval supremacy. Midway shattered that dream beyond repair. The empire still stretched thousands of miles, but its heart, its carrier fleet, had been torn out in one afternoon. On the American side, the victory was greeted with quiet disbelief. In Pearl Harbor, where blackened wrecks still lined the harbor floor, sailors gathered around radios to hear the news. Some wept openly. Others just stared at the sea as if expecting the ghosts of December 7th to rise and salute. For Admiral Nimitz, it was vindication, the first proof that the tide could be turned by courage, intelligence, and the will to endure. Yet even he knew the cost. When he visited the surviving crews at Pearl Harbor, he said only, "They were brave men, on both sides." In the years that followed, Midway became legend, studied, debated, mythologized. Historians called it the most decisive naval battle in history. But for those who had seen it, there was no myth, only memory. The Pacific War still raged on for 3 more brutal years, but Japan was now on the defensive, retreating island by island under a storm of American steel. By 1945, Japan's once mighty fleet was gone, its harbors filled with wreckage. Yet in that ruin lay a quiet truth. The defeat at Midway had not only broken an empire, it had awakened a democracy. The same America that had been caught sleeping at Pearl Harbor had risen, armed not only with weapons but with will. It had turned despair into determination, loss into momentum, and built a fleet so vast it darkened the horizon. When the war finally ended, the ocean between Midway and Tokyo was calm again. Beneath its surface still lay the twisted hulks of carriers, planes, and men, silent witnesses to the day the Pacific changed forever. Midway was not just a victory of arms, but of endurance, a reminder that empires built on domination crumble, while nations built on resilience rise from fire. The smoke that drifted over the sea in June 1942 carried more than the scent of war. It carried the birth of a new world, forged in sacrifice, sealed in steel, and forever remembered in the echoes of the Pacific,